In that November of 1177, the desert of the Holy Land breathed fire. Along the sandy paths that wound between Ascalon and Ramla, 26,000 warriors of Islam marched with the certainty of those who already taste victory. Their green banners rippled like waves of an ocean of steel. Their drums beat the rhythm of conquest. At the front, Saladin watched the horizon where Jerusalem awaited defenseless. But among the hills surrounding Montgisard, something waited. Not an army, only 500 knights covered in dust and faith, and a 16-year-old boy whose hands rotted beneath linen bandages. And then the impossible happened. From atop a ridge, a wall of iron crashed down upon the Muslim lines. Horses collided with horses. Lances pierced armor. Cries in Latin mixed with prayers in Arabic. The ground trembled. Dust rose like a curtain of storm. Templars in white mantles tore through enemy ranks like lightning cutting through night. At the center of the chaos, mounted upon a war horse, a teenager with his face shadowed by his helm raised a sword that his ruined hands should not have been able to grip. When the sun set over Montgisard, 20,000 bodies lay scattered across the hills. The greatest Muslim army assembled since the First Crusade had ceased to exist, and Saladin, the invincible conqueror, fled through the desert mounted on a racing camel, leaving behind his treasure, his banners, and his reputation. This is the story of how 500 men crushed 26,000. Of how a leper king defied death and mathematics. Of how faith became more powerful than any sword. To understand the miracle of Montgisard, one must first understand the world that existed before it. The year 1177 found the Middle East divided between two civilizations on a collision course. On one side, the Crusader states, fragile kingdoms established along the Levantine coast after the First Crusade. On the other, the Islamic world, fragmented for decades by internal disputes, but now unified under a single will. That will had a name that made Christians tremble: Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The West knew him simply as Saladin. Born in Tikrit, in Mesopotamia, Saladin had risen from Kurdish officer to absolute lord of Egypt and Syria. In less than a decade, he had accomplished what no Muslim leader had achieved since the days of Nur ad-Din. He had united under his command an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. His coffers overflowed with gold from Egyptian trade. His arsenals produced weapons on an industrial scale. His armies were composed of the most fearsome warriors in the Islamic world, the Mamluks, slave soldiers trained from infancy to be perfect killing machines. For Saladin, the reconquest of Jerusalem was not merely a political ambition, it was a sacred duty. The city that housed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, had been in the hands of European invaders for nearly 80 years. Every day that passed without the city being liberated was an affront to Allah, and Saladin intended to correct that affront. On the other side of the border, the kingdom of Jerusalem was dying. Founded by the heroes of the First Crusade, the kingdom had reached its territorial peak decades earlier, but now withered like a body consumed by fever. Disputes among nobles drained resources that should have been used for defense. Reinforcements from Europe arrived ever more sparse, and on the throne sat a child. Baldwin IV had been crowned king at 13, following the premature death of his father, Amalric. From the beginning, everyone knew his reign would be brief, not because of external enemies, but because of an enemy that lived within his own body. The discovery had been made years earlier, when Baldwin was still a prince. His tutor, Archbishop William of Tyre, was watching the boys of the court playing in the courtyard when he noticed something strange. While the other boys screamed and recoiled when pinched or bitten during roughhousing, Baldwin did not react. His right arm remained motionless, insensible. William conducted discreet tests. He pricked the boy's skin with needles. No reaction. He brought flames close to his fingers, no recoil. The diagnosis was inescapable, though no one dared pronounce it aloud. The Crown Prince of Jerusalem had leprosy. In the Middle Ages, leprosy was not merely a disease, it was a sentence. Lepers were considered unclean, cursed by God, punished for sins they might not even know they had committed. They were expelled from their communities, forced to wear bells to alert people of their approach, forbidden to touch any healthy person. Throughout Christendom, there was only one fate for a leper: isolation in a colony of the sick, awaiting a slow and agonizing death. But Baldwin was not a peasant. He was the only male heir to the throne of Jerusalem. And so, for the first time in medieval history, a leper was crowned king. The early years of Baldwin's reign were marked by cautious hope. The leprosy progressed slowly. The young king could still ride, could still wield a sword, could still inspire his men. Under his initial regency, and then under his direct command, the kingdom managed to resist Saladin's first attacks. But by 1177, the situation had deteriorated drastically. The leprosy was beginning to consume Baldwin at an accelerated rate. His hands were losing sensation and beginning to show the first ulcers. His face, still intact, displayed the first signs of the devastation to come. Physicians estimated he had months, perhaps a few years. Marriage was out of the question. Having heirs, impossible. The kingdom desperately needed a successor, but Baldwin refused to abdicate while he could still serve. And it was at this moment of maximum weakness that Saladin decided to strike. The autumn of 1177 offered Saladin an opportunity that seemed forged by destiny itself. Philip of Alsace, one of the most powerful nobles in Europe, had arrived in the Holy Land with a large contingent of crusaders. Normally, this would have been terrible news for the Muslims, but Philip, driven by personal ambition and political disputes, decided to take most of the Christian forces north to attack the Muslim fortress of Hama. With him went Raymond of Tripoli, Bohemond of Antioch, much of the Knights Hospitaller, and a significant fraction of the Templars. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was left virtually undefended. It was as if someone had removed all the sentinels from a fortress and left the gates open. Saladin was not a man to waste opportunities. In mid-November, he crossed the Sinai with an overwhelming army. Estimates vary, but contemporary sources speak of 26,000 men. It was a force composed of the finest the Islamic world had to offer. 8,000 Mamluks formed the core of heavy cavalry, warriors who had been purchased as slaves in childhood and trained their entire lives for war. Mounted archers from the steppes of Central Asia flanked the columns. Syrian and Egyptian infantry marched in disciplined formations. Siege engineers transported equipment capable of bringing down any wall. Saladin's plan was elegant in its simplicity. March directly to Jerusalem, capture the city before any relief could arrive, and end once and for all the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. With the bulk of the Christian army lost in the north and only a dying king to defend the Holy City, victory seemed inevitable. In Jerusalem, news of the invasion arrived like lightning from a clear sky. Baldwin was bedridden, fighting another bout of fever that the leprosy brought. His advisors panicked. Some suggested negotiating an honorable surrender. Others proposed that the king flee to Tyre, where he could resist indefinitely behind impregnable walls. The mathematics were cruel and incontestable. Against 26,000 warriors, Jerusalem had no possible defense, but Baldwin rejected all proposals of flight or surrender. The young king summoned his nobles and made a pronouncement that left everyone stunned. He would not hide. He would not negotiate. He would march to meet Saladin with whatever force he could gather. When they questioned his sanity, Baldwin responded with words that would be remembered for centuries. "God gave me this disease for a purpose. When we achieve victory, No man will be able to say it was by human strength. The declaration was so absurd, it bordered on madness. Victory. With what army? Jerusalem could barely gather a few hundred knights. The ratio would be more than 50 enemies for every Christian defender. But something in Baldwin's conviction ignited a flame in the hearts of his men. Odo de Saint-Amand, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was the first to kneel. The Templars had taken vows never to retreat, never to surrender, never to show mercy to the enemies of Christ. If a dying boy could face annihilation with faith, how could they do less? One by one, the knights present followed suit, not in submission, but in something far more powerful, in belief. Baldwin departed Jerusalem at dawn the following day, personally leading the column. With him marched 375 knights, the few who remained in the city. At Ascalon, they managed to join the 80 Templars from the local garrison, raising the total heavy cavalry to just under 500 men. The infantry numbered perhaps 3,000 soldiers, many of them last-minute recruits summoned by the arrière-ban. The general call that obligated every Christian capable of bearing arms to present themselves for the defense of the realm. It was an army of the desperate. Against them marched the most powerful military force the Islamic world had assembled in generations. Saladin, meanwhile, advanced with the confidence of the invincible. His scouts had confirmed that Jerusalem was virtually defenseless. The leper king would surely hide behind the walls, praying for a miracle that would not come. There was no rush, no need to maintain strict battle formation. The Sultan allowed his troops to spread across the region, pillaging villages, collecting supplies, prematurely celebrating the victory that was about to come. That confidence would be his undoing. Baldwin did not hide in Ascalon. Instead, he led his small army in a bold maneuver, circling around the Muslim force along the coast and then turning inland. It was a brutal march. 45 miles in little more than a day, under the scorching November sun, men and horses pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Baldwin himself could barely stay in the saddle. Fever consumed him. His bandaged hands bled where the reins cut into ulcerated skin. Several times he lost consciousness and had to be carried on a litter by the Templars. But each time he awoke, his first words were always the same: continue the march. On the morning of November 25th, the Christian scouts brought electrifying news. Saladin's army had been located near Montgisard, a hill between Ramla and Ibelin, and it was completely scattered. The Sultan had committed the classic error of the overconfident commander. Believing there was no possible threat, he had allowed his troops to spread for miles. Foraging parties roamed the countryside. Cavalry rested separately from infantry. Officers argued over the division of Jerusalem's spoils, which they considered already conquered. The discipline that made Saladin's armies so fearsome had dissolved in the certainty of easy victory. When Baldwin received the report, he immediately understood what it meant. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, he allowed himself a smile. God has delivered them into our hands. The king ordered the army to form in charging position. The Templars would take the vanguard, forming a wedge of heavy cavalry that would serve as the spearhead. The secular knights would form the second wave, exploiting any gap opened by the warrior monks. The infantry would remain in reserve, hidden in low ground, ready to attack when the Muslims were fully committed. It was a suicidal formation against an enemy in prepared position. But against a scattered and unsuspecting enemy, it might work. Before giving the signal to attack, Baldwin insisted on being lifted from his litter and placed on his war horse. Knights rushed to strap him to the saddle, for his legs no longer had the strength to support him. Fresh blood stained the bandages on his hands as he gripped the reins. But when his voice sounded, it carried across the entire Christian line. Gentlemen, David faced Goliath with faith. We faced 26,000 with God. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the charge began. The Templar wedge descended the hill like an avalanche of iron. 80 knights in perfect formation, lances nearly 12 feet long leveled, war horses trained to kill. The sound of their hooves echoed through the valley like divine thunder itself. The Muslims saw the charge approaching, but could not process what they were witnessing. 500 men charging against 26,000 was not military tactics. It was mass suicide. For precious seconds, the Mamluks simply stood paralyzed, unable to believe what their eyes showed them. Those seconds cost thousands of lives. The impact was like mountains colliding. Templar lances pierced mail armor as if it were parchment. 300 Mamluks simply ceased to exist in the first moments, crushed under iron hooves or transfixed by ash lances. War horses, trained for violence, bit and kicked, adding to the chaos. But the real surprise came from what happened next. Instead of wheeling away after the initial charge, as cavalry doctrine demanded, the Templars kept going. They plunged even deeper into Muslim ranks, like a blade seeking a heart. Behind them, Baldwin and the 420 secular knights struck in a second wave, exploiting the gap torn by the warrior monks. The cry of Deus Vult echoed over the battlefield, drowning out the desperate commands of Muslim officers. Saladin watched from atop an elevation, unable to believe what he saw. His army, the most powerful force assembled since the First Crusade, was being pushed back by a handful of fanatics. The mathematics did not work. The physics made no sense, but it was happening. The Sultan tried to organize a countercharge. He sent orders for his reserves to advance, for scattered squadrons to reassemble. But reassembling an army spread over miles takes time, and Baldwin would give them no time at all. The Muslim center began to buckle. Not retreat, buckle, like a dam cracking under pressure. The Mamluks, warriors who had faced Byzantine cataphracts and Nubian cavalry without flinching, began to waver. The sight of Templars advancing, unstoppable, relentless, covered in blood, and screaming the name of their god, was too much for any human morale to bear. And then Baldwin revealed his masterstroke. The 3,000 Christian infantry, hidden in low ground throughout the cavalry charge, suddenly emerged on the Muslim flank. The psychological impact was devastating. To Saladin's already shaken forces, it seemed Crusader armies were materializing from nowhere. Cries that they were surrounded spread through the Muslim lines. Militarily, it was absurd, but panic does not calculate odds. The Muslim line broke. What had begun as an organized retreat transformed into total rout. Elite Mamluks, who had sworn to die before abandoning their sultan, fled in terror. Knights who had never known defeat abandoned their weapons and ran. The discipline that had built empires evaporated in minutes. Baldwin, strapped to his saddle, bleeding from wounds he could not feel, pursued the fugitives with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. His sword rose and fell in mechanical rhythm. Around him, his knights slaughtered enemies with the efficiency of butchers. Broken lances were replaced by swords. Blunted swords were replaced by maces. Some Templars, having lost all weapons, beat enemies to death with their own helmets. Saladin saw his personal standard fall beneath a wave of Christian knights. He saw his war treasury captured. He saw the men he was supposed to protect cut down by the thousands. And he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Abandoning his war horse, too slow for flight, the Sultan mounted a racing camel, an animal reserved for messengers who needed maximum speed. The sight of their lord fleeing on a pack animal destroyed whatever resistance remained. The Muslims who still fought simply gave up. The pursuit continued for hours. The Crusaders hunted fugitives for miles, cutting down anyone they found. The ravines and valleys surrounding Montgisard became death traps. Muslims who tried to escape through these paths found themselves cornered with no possibility of flight. Bodies piled in layers, the dead cushioning the dying suffocating beneath more dead. When the carnage finally ceased, it was not from mercy. It was because the Christian horses, pushed beyond all limits during the forced march and battle, simply began to collapse. Their mighty hearts finally gave out after achieving the impossible. The sun was setting over a battlefield that defied description. For miles in every direction, Muslim bodies covered the ground. Some ravines were so full of corpses they formed macabre bridges of flesh. Abandoned weapons glinted in the setting sun like iron seeds scattered across the earth. Of the 26,000 warriors who had marched with Saladin that morning, fewer than 2,000 would see sunset. 20,000 Muslims lay dead in the fields of Montgisard. The Crusaders had lost 1,100 men, with 750 wounded. Terrible numbers for such a small force, but insignificant compared to the Islamic catastrophe. Baldwin finally allowed himself to be lifted from his horse. He collapsed immediately, his body devastated by leprosy, having been pushed beyond any reasonable limit. Knights rushed to aid their king, but he waved them away with a weak gesture. There was one last thing he needed to do, right there on that field of death. Surrounded by 20,000 corpses, the leper king led his exhausted army in prayer. Non nobis Domine non nobis, sed nomine tuo de gloriam. Not unto us, Lord, not unto us, but to thy name give glory. The sight of 500 blood-covered warriors kneeling in prayer, surrounded by a landscape of absolute destruction, would be etched into the memory of all who were present. Christians and Muslims, victors and prisoners, all felt they had witnessed something that transcended ordinary war. Saladin's humiliation was complete. The man who had never known defeat arrived in Cairo with fewer than 2,000 survivors. His racing camel had saved his life, but destroyed his reputation. Warriors who flee on pack animals do not inspire loyalty. The political consequences were immediate and devastating. The careful alliance Saladin had built over decades cracked in a single afternoon. Syria questioned its vassalage. Egypt murmured about change in leadership. The emirs who had bowed before the invincible sultan now saw only a man who had fled from 500 Christians. For the Muslim world, the defeat was a theological blow as much as a military one. If 26,000 warriors could not defeat 500 Christians, what did that say about divine favor? From the mosques of Cairo to those of Damascus, the faithful sought answers that no one could provide. Ibn al-Athir, the great Muslim chronicler, called Montgisard the most terrible catastrophe to strike Islam in this age. Another scribe recorded simply that Allah had turned his face away that day. For the Crusader states, the victory was a literal miracle. Jerusalem, which had prepared for the end, suddenly had a future. The treasures captured from Saladin's army, tons of gold meant to finance a long campaign, filled the coffers of the bankrupt kingdom. Military equipment sufficient to arm every Christian fortress in the Levant was recovered from the battlefield. Baldwin IV ordered a Benedictine monastery built on the site of the battle, dedicated to St. Catherine of Alexandria, on whose feast day the miracle had occurred. It was a memorial not only to the dead, but to the moment when faith had overcome mathematics. But for Baldwin himself, the victory came at a terrible cost. The superhuman effort the battle had demanded dramatically accelerated the progression of his leprosy. In the weeks following Montgisard, the ulcers on his hands and feet multiplied. The disease, which had progressed slowly for years, now advanced with terrifying speed. Modern medical historians believe the campaign, with its nights sleeping in the field, without proper care for his wounds, was the trigger that transformed Baldwin's leprosy from the milder form to the most devastating form of the disease. By saving his kingdom, the young king had sealed his own death sentence. Even so, Baldwin continued to reign for 8 more years, 8 years of constant physical decline, compensated by a mind that remained sharp as Damascus steel. At 20, he was blind. At 22, he could no longer walk. At 23, he could barely speak. But until the end, his mere presence was enough to unite the quarreling nobles of his kingdom. In 1183, when Saladin besieged the castle of Kerak during a royal wedding, Baldwin had to be carried across the desert on a litter. The mere approach of the leper king was enough to convince Saladin to withdraw. The terror that day at Montgisard had inspired never completely disappeared. Baldwin died in 1185 at 24 years of age. Saladin, when he learned of the death of his greatest adversary, reportedly said he feared that man more than any army. The tragic irony is that the kingdom Baldwin saved did not survive long after his death. Without the inspired leadership of the leper king, the Crusader states quickly fragmented. Ambitious nobles fought for power. Alliances dissolved. The unity that had made Montgisard possible evaporated. 2 years after Baldwin's death, in 1187, Saladin returned with a new army. This time, there was no dying boy to stop him. At the Battle of Hattin, the Sultan destroyed the Crusader army using the lessons Montgisard had taught him. Never underestimate desperate men. Never assume victory before battle is joined. Never let confidence become carelessness. Jerusalem fell a few months later, almost 90 years after it had been conquered by the First Crusade. But the legacy of Montgisard transcended its time. The battle remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary examples of victory against impossible odds in military history. Military academies study Baldwin's tactics, the way he exploited enemy dispersion, the chronometric precision of his staggered charge, the psychological use of the infantry reserve. More than tactics, however, Montgisard demonstrated something that transcends war manuals. It demonstrated that human will, when ignited by absolute conviction, can overcome any numerical disadvantage. 500 men who believed God fought at their side proved more valuable than 26,000 who doubted. Chroniclers from both sides, Christian and Muslim, agreed that something supernatural had occurred that day. How else to explain that horses exhausted from a forced march managed to catch fresh cavalry? How else to explain that a teenager whose hands were rotting managed to raise a sword and lead a charge? How else to explain that 500 defeated 26,000? The Christians had a simple answer. The strength of God flowed through them. The Muslims, horrified, offered a similar explanation, only inverted. Allah had turned away his gaze. Perhaps both were right, or perhaps the truth is even deeper. Perhaps Montgisard is eternal proof that sometimes, just sometimes, courage counts more than numbers. That faith can move mountains, that a dying boy with bandaged hands and a destroyed body can change the course of history simply by refusing to accept the impossible. 8 centuries have passed since that November afternoon. The hills of Montgisard are today peaceful fields with no visible mark of the carnage that occurred there. The monastery Baldwin built disappeared long ago, destroyed by the tides of history. But the echo of that day still resonates when we speak of last stands, when we celebrate improbable victories, when we remember moments when human determination overcame impossible odds. Montgisard is there, a golden shadow in humanity's collective memory. 500 against 26,000. A leper king whose hands could not feel the sword he wielded. A charge that defied reason, and a lesson that crosses the centuries, whispered by the wind that still blows over those ancient hills. Sometimes, faith is the only weapon that matters.